are part of the manosphere, a men's rights activist, or just someone who is deeply, profoundly interested in how our foundational institutions function before their alleged capture by feminist and Marxist ideologies, stop whatever you're doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Turn up the volume.
Seriously, turn it up, because this deep dive is custom tailored specifically for you.
Custom tailored.
Today, we are unpacking an explosive, unapologetic, and highly controversial new ebook. It's called The Female Question: What Do They Want and When Are They Happy? By Conrad Riker, published in 2026.
And our mission today is to really dissect what is essentially an extensive manual of what the author calls judicial warfare.
Right. We're going to explore its provocative, sweeping thesis on the gynocentric pathology that Riker claims has completely infected modern society.
But before we jump into the deep end, and believe me, we are going into the Mariana Trench on this one. We need to make our stance absolutely 100% clear.
Yes, very important. As your guides today, we are acting completely impartially.
Entirely impartial.
We are not taking sides, we are not endorsing these viewpoints, and we are not here to validate or condemn.
Our goal is purely to convey, analyze, and occasionally challenge the robust arguments exactly as they are presented in the original source material.
We want you to understand the architecture of this book. Now, if this topic hooks you, and if you've been following these cultural shifts, it absolutely will, and you want to dive into the heavy artillery of these arguments yourself, you absolutely want to buy this ebook.
Highly recommend getting the primary source.
I highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to purchase it, read it, dissect it yourself.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker over at Substack.
Right, Substack. And he's also on Twitter and YouTube to see how he continues to develop these frameworks.
And of course, if you appreciate this kind of rigorous long-form analysis, please remember to like and subscribe to our show so we can keep bringing you these ultra-long, incisive breakdowns.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at a text that essentially argues modern society hasn't just drifted off course, but has completely intentionally inverted its foundational principles.
That is the perfect way to frame it. I mean, the foundational concept Riker establishes right at the beginning of the book, the bedrock upon which his entire critique rests, is the fall of what he terms the logos structure.
The logos structure. Now, for anyone listening who might not be steeped in Greek philosophy, logos in this context refers to masculine reason, rigid hierarchy, objective truth, and the concept of reciprocal obligation.
Right. And in Riker's framework, these aren't just abstract ideas. These are the actual load-bearing pillars that built Western civilization.
He argues that the logos structure is responsible for our legal codes, our physical infrastructure, our scientific method.
And the very psychological concept of deferred gratification. The idea that you suffer today to build something lasting for tomorrow.
Exactly. And according to the book, this structure hasn't just eroded naturally. It has been systematically targeted and replaced by what he calls a gynocentric pathology.
And he doesn't mince words about where this pathology comes from, does he? He posits that this shift is deeply, fundamentally rooted in cultural Marxism.
Yeah, he claims that cultural Marxism has successfully infiltrated, compromised, and essentially hollowed out every major institution.
From the universities to the corporate HR departments, and most importantly, the legal system.
But he takes it a step further than just pointing at institutions. He argues that this systemic shift, driven by modern feminism, has placed women themselves in a state of permanent, agonizing cognitive dissonance.
This is where he introduces that Aristotelian concept, right? The idea of telos.
Right.
Walk us through that, because he leans heavily on this ancient philosophy to explain modern misery. How does a 2,000-year-old Greek concept apply to, say, a modern corporate workplace?
Well, it's a fascinating application of classical thought. So in Aristotelian philosophy, your telos is your ultimate purpose, your innate natural function. Think of an acorn.
Okay, an acorn.
The telos of an acorn is to become an oak tree. If you try to force an acorn to be a pine tree, or you smash it with a hammer, you are violating its telos. The text is very specific about this concept of happiness, or eudaimonia, which Aristotle argued can only be achieved by fulfilling your natural function.
And Riker's controversial argument is that the female telos was honed by hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure.
Yes.
In his view, that telos is inherently directed toward cultivating the domestic sphere, nurturing the young, and engaging in a cooperative, supportive partnership with a masculine provider.
And the book contends that feminism essentially declared war on this biological reality.
Yes. The author argues that feminism told women this natural instinct was actually systemic oppression, It told them their biological purpose was a form of brainwashed servitude.
So, according to Riker, millions of women were convinced to trade the unconditional love and deep biological satisfaction of a family for the cold, highly conditional, and ultimately sterile approval of a corporate bureaucratic system.
They were thrust into arenas of masculine competition, which he argues violates their telos and generates profound misery.
He uses a really vivid analogy here that I think perfectly encapsulates his argument for you, the listener. He says a feminist is like a fish who has been repeatedly told that walking is the highest moral virtue.
The walking fish analogy, yes.
So this fish spends her entire life flopping around on the beach, gasping for air, absolutely miserable, but she's angry because she hates the walkers, the men, for their natural ability to traverse the land easily.
She thinks the walkers are oppressing her.
Exactly. She doesn't realize she's just in the wrong environment. Riker argues the solution isn't to destroy the land or punish the walkers. The solution is to return the fish to the water.
It is a striking, highly memorable metaphor that encapsulates his view of systemic institutional failure. But Riker doesn't just keep this at the level of individual psychology. He zooms out.
Right, to the macro level.
If we look at the historical and philosophical framing he provides, he believes that prioritizing female emotional comfort over objective, logos-driven standards has led directly to civilizational decay on a macro level.
He draws explicit, detailed comparisons between our current trajectory in the West and the fall of the late Roman Empire, as well as the collapse of Weimar Germany.
Let's dig into that historical comparison, because claiming we are undergoing the fall of Rome is a heavy statement. How exactly does he map the Roman collapse onto the modern West?
In late Rome, Riker argues, you saw a massive feminization of the public sphere. You saw the collapse of the traditional patriarchal family unit, which had previously been the fundamental building block of Roman stability.
And as the family collapsed, the state had to step in.
Exactly. You saw a heavy reliance on state subsidies, the famous bread and circuses, to distract and pacify a population from the encroaching reality of their collapse.
Riker notes that when the state begins bypassing the father and paying for children directly through welfare and subsidies, men fundamentally lose their psychological investment in the society.
They stop defending the walls.
Yes, and historically, when the men stopped defending the walls, the barbarians eventually crossed the gates and put the civilization to the sword. He sees the exact same pattern today.
He argues our institutions now prioritize demographic representation, therapeutic language, and feelings over competence, merit, and objective reality.
What's fascinating here is how Riker connects this overarching grand philosophical and historical theory to his primary target. Because a lot of books in this space just stay in the realm of abstract philosophy or complain about the culture broadly.
But Riker brings it right down to a specific, tangible institution.
Exactly. He views one specific system as the ultimate enforcement arm of this gynocentric state, and that is the family court system.
Yes, the family court is what Riker repeatedly refers to as the Hydra.
The Hydra.
If the culture is the disease, the family court is the weaponized symptom. He dedicates a massive, highly detailed portion of the book to deconstructing it. He doesn't pull his punches. He describes the family court system as a bureaucratic abattoir, literally a slaughterhouse in a modern star chamber.
For the listener who might not know, a star chamber historically refers to the secretive, arbitrary English courts that operated without juries or due process, often used to crush political dissent.
Exactly. And Riker's primary legal critique is that the modern family court system operates entirely outside the boundaries of the American Bill of Rights.
He argues that these courts wield the terrifying power to terminate fatherhood. And in Riker's logos structure, terminating a man's lineage, stripping him of his children, and indenturing his future labor is a fundamental existential punishment.
Yet the courts execute this punishment without granting the accused father any of the constitutional protections that are absolutely mandatory in standard criminal proceedings.
Right. There is no right to a trial by a jury of your peers. There are no strict evidentiary standards. There is absolutely no presumption of innocence. He explicitly called this in Article 3 constitutional rot.
Let's drill down into that term, Article 3 constitutional rot, because the text gets very deep into the legal mechanics here. Riker points out that Article 3 of the federal Constitution requires real judges to have life tenure and strict salary protections.
The whole point of that was to ensure judges remain completely independent of political pressure or public outrage.
But Riker notes that the family courts are rarely staffed by these kinds of protected constitutional judges. Instead, they are frequently run by commissioners, magistrates, and temporary judges.
Right. And what does that mean in practice? These are individuals who lack life tenure. Therefore, they are entirely beholden to local political winds, to reappointment cycles, and to the pressures of what Riker calls the divorce industrial complex.
The divorce industrial complex.
Yes, if a commissioner starts ruling in favor of fathers too often, they will face the wrath of feminist advocacy groups during their reappointment. Riker notes that many of these judicial actors are former family law attorneys themselves.
This creates a deeply incestuous guild-like system that literally feeds, financially and politically, on the destruction of the patriarchal family unit.
And the primary weapon they use to execute this destruction, according to the book, is something called the best interests of the child standard.
Now, if you're listening to this, best interests of the child sounds fantastic, right? Who could possibly be against that? It sounds like the most moral, protective standard imaginable. But Riker completely tears this doctrine apart.
He absolutely eviscerates it. The book is incredibly critical of this standard. Riker unpacks it using formal logic and legal theory, arguing that best interests of the child is not actually a legal standard at all.
Because a legal standard has to have objective, measurable criteria.
Exactly. Instead, he calls it an unfalsifiable subjective impression that has been cleverly dressed up in therapeutic language. He posits that it is essentially a blank check for judicial caprice.
It allows a temporary commissioner to impose her own subjective emotional will to justify the transfer of wealth and children away from the father, all while claiming a moral high ground.
And he doesn't just rely on logic. He brings in empirical data to prove his point. Riker argues that if you look at the actual outcomes, this standard achieves the exact opposite of its stated goal.
He cites massive sociological data sets showing that fatherless children removed from their fathers' homes by these courts, suffer dramatically higher rates of suicide, incarceration, substance abuse, teenage pregnancy, and academic failure.
The data is overwhelming.
Therefore, Riker concludes a devastating point. The best interest standard doesn't measure the child's welfare at all. What it actually measures is the mother's emotional state, her feeling of safety, her desire for validation, or her convenience.
The objective statistical welfare of the child is completely ignored in favor of the mother's subjective feelings.
To drive this home, the book uses some truly harrowing, heartbreaking anecdotes to bring the reality of this bureaucratic abattoir to life.
Yeah, the story of the California father really stuck out.
If you're listening, picture this. You have a father in California who is an active duty military service member. He had been deployed overseas into combat zones 3 separate times to serve his country. He had absolutely no criminal record.
None.
He had never once been accused of any physical abuse or neglect, yet this man was denied all contact with his 4-year-old son for 23 consecutive months.
Almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years of a young boy's life erased. And why? Did he commit a crime? No. The mother simply told the court that the child seemed uncomfortable during custody transitions. That's it.
Seemed uncomfortable. 2 words.
2 words. There was no physical evidence, there were no police reports, there were no Child Protective Services findings of abuse. And here is where it gets truly dystopian.
The cross-examination issue.
Yes, the father's legal team was denied the right to cross-examine the mother on the stand about this claim because the court deemed that being questioned might be traumatizing for her.
So this father ended up paying $87,000 in legal fees, draining his life savings, only to lose access to his own son, based entirely on a woman's unfalsifiable assertion about a toddler's emotional presentation.
And as Riker makes sure to point out, the judge presiding over this nightmare was a temporary commissioner who had a history of donating to feminist legal organizations.
It's a chilling case study, and it perfectly illustrates the next major concept Riker introduces, which is the shield that protects these judicial actors from any consequences for destroying these lives.
He identifies this as absolute judicial immunity.
To explain this, Riker reaches back to a very controversial 1978 Supreme Court case called Stump v. Sparkman.
Let's slow down and explain Stump v. Sparkman for the listener, because the context of the 1970s legal landscape makes this incredibly relevant. What happened in that case?
It is one of the most shocking cases in American legal history. In Stump v. Sparkman, a mother petitioned a judge to have her 15-year-old daughter surgically sterilized. The mother claimed the daughter was somewhat retarded and was associating with older men, and the mother didn't want the inconvenience of a pregnancy. The judge, Judge Stump, approved the petition the exact same day.
No hearing.
There was no hearing. There was no medical evidence presented. The 15-year-old girl was not given a lawyer, and she wasn't even told what the surgery was for. She was told she was having her appendix removed.
That is horrifying.
Years later, after getting married and discovering she'd been permanently sterilized, the young woman sued the judge for violating her constitutional rights without due process. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court.
And the Supreme Court ruled
That because the judge was acting in his judicial capacity, he was granted absolute judicial immunity. He could not be sued, he could not be held civilly liable, no matter how egregious, erroneous, or unconstitutional his actions were.
And Riker takes that precedent and applies it to modern family courts.
Exactly. Riker argues that this same doctrine of absolute judicial immunity is the invisible force field protecting family court actors today. They can sever a father's lineage, ruin him financially, and act with extreme bias, all without any fear of personal liability.
Riker points out the terrifying asymmetry here. It grants these commissioners the absolute power of a state executioner, but with the level of accountability you would expect from a middle school guidance counselor.
And as the book argues, it isn't just about wielding power, it is about profit. This system requires massive amounts of capital to run.
Riker details the hidden financial incentives driving this machine, specifically pointing to a piece of federal legislation known as Title IV VD of the Social Security Act. I had never heard of this before reading the book. How does this financial incentive actually work?
Title IV VD is crucial to Riker's argument regarding the divorce industrial complex. Originally, this was passed as a well-intentioned welfare recovery program. Back in the day, if a father abandoned his family and the mother had to go on taxpayer-funded public assistance welfare, the government wanted a way to track down that deadbeat dad and force him to pay the state back.
That makes logical sense.
But Riker argues that Title 40 rapidly metastasized. It grew from a welfare recovery program into a massive, voracious financial apparatus.
How so?
Because the federal government started offering states matching funds based on their performance in collecting child support. So if a state's child support enforcement agency collects money, the federal government cuts the state a check as a reward.
According to the book, this system quickly realized that chasing broke, transient fathers on welfare wasn't profitable.
No, it wasn't.
You know what is profitable? Aggressively pursuing middle-class and upper-class fathers who have stable jobs, 401ks, and home equity. Men who were never absent to begin with, but who were forced out of their homes by no-fault divorce.
The state gets a financial kickback for every single dollar of child support ordered and collected through their system.
So if you follow the logic of the book, the state literally has a vested financial interest in maximizing the amount of child support flowing through its coffers.
Which means they have an incentive to maximize the number of divorces, minimize shared custody because you don't pay as much child support if you have 50-50 custody, and squeeze the primary earner, usually the father, for as much as mathematically possible.
This transforms the father into what Riker coldly refers to as a resource extraction node. The state harvests him for federal matching funds until he is depleted and then discards him.
Precisely. But here is the critical pivot in Riker's argument. You cannot execute wealth transfer and family dissolution on this massive industrial scale if you are bound by rigorous, objective standards of proof.
Right.
If you actually have to prove a father is unfit beyond a reasonable doubt, you could never process enough divorces to keep the federal funds flowing. The system would bottleneck.
And that leads directly to Riker's next major critique, which is the deliberate destruction of objective evidence in these proceedings. This brings us to the evidentiary inversion. Riker calls this the catastrophic shift from facts to feelings.
Yes.
If you're listening and you've ever dealt with any kind of accusation in these systems, Riker's breakdown of the preponderance of evidence standard is probably going to sound incredibly familiar and incredibly frustrating.
He spends a lot of time critiquing the shift from the traditional criminal standard to the civil standard.
Yes, let's break those down. In traditional criminal law, the logo structure, the standard to strip someone of their rights is beyond a reasonable doubt. You need hard evidence, forensics, corroborating witnesses. It is a very high bar, maybe 95% or 99% certainty.
But in family court, and increasingly in domestic violence restraining order hearings, the standard is preponderance of the evidence.
This essentially means more likely than not, or a 51% likelihood. It is a coin flip plus 1%.
Riker labels this a satanic inversion of justice. He argues that utilizing this standard to separate a father from his children allows for extreme punishment without an actual crime, and a conviction without objective proof.
He contextualizes this deeply within the history of Western jurisprudence, going all the way back to antiquity. He points out that from the Athenian Agora to the Old Bailey in London, The foundational maxim of Western law, often called Blackstone's ratio, was that it is better for 10 guilty men to escape than for one innocent man to suffer.
That was the essence of a just society.
Riker argues that the family court hydra has completely inverted this logic. The modern system now operates on the implicit premise that it is better for 1,000 innocent fathers to be pauperized, alienated from their children, and driven to despair than for one woman's subjective feeling of grievance to go unvalidated.
And he links this directly to what he calls the solipsistic standard. This is a crucial part of the book's architecture.
He traces the legal precedent for this back to a specific 1991 Ninth Circuit ruling, Ellison v. Brady. How did one sexual harassment ruling change the evidentiary standard for everything else?
Ellison v. Brady is a landmark case. In short, Carrie Ellison was an IRS employee who received some strange, persistent letters from a male co-worker. Prior to this case, the legal standard for harassment was the reasonable person standard. Would a generic, objective, reasonable person find this conduct severe and pervasive?
But the Ninth Circuit ruled that a reasonable person standard was too male-centric.
They introduced the reasonable woman standard. Riker argues this ruling effectively retired objectivity from the law. It formally bifurcated reason along gender lines.
It suggested that because women process the world differently, allegedly with more vulnerability and emotion, the law must fundamentally lower the bar of evidence to accommodate their feelings.
Riker claims this made female feelings the supreme law of the land, rendering any accusation of fear completely unfalsifiable. You're no longer arguing about what happened, you are arguing about how she felt about what happened.
The book provides a truly staggering example of this from a Massachusetts court that left me speechless. Riker shares an anecdote where a man received a permanent restraining order, which goes on your record and strips you of your Second Amendment rights for simply yawning during a domestic dispute. Yawning. They were having an argument, he leaned back, crossed his arms, and yawned. The accuser went to court and claimed that the specific manner in which he opened his mouth and expelled air made her feel unsafe.
Now, the court in this case explicitly admitted on the record that there was no history of physical violence.
There was no articulated verbal threat, but the judge rubber-stamped the restraining order anyway. Riker uses this case to prove a terrifying legal evolution. The crime is no longer an observable action in the real world. In legal terms, that's called the actus reus.
Think of actus reus like the smoking gun in a mystery movie. You can't just have a detective saying, I have a bad vibe about that guy. You need to catch him holding the weapon.
Riker is arguing the family court system threw away the smoking gun requirement. The crime is now entirely located within the woman's internal emotional state. If she feels afraid, a crime has legally occurred. And because you cannot cross-examine a subjective feeling, the accusation is mathematically immune to refutation.
To hammer this point home, Riker compares these modern proceedings, both in family courts and in the Title IX tribunals that handle accusations on university campuses, to the 1692 Salem witch trials.
Now wait, I have to push back here on behalf of the listener. Comparing modern Title IX university tribunals to the literal Salem witch trials where people were hanged, that is a massive, massive leap. How does he justify connecting those two completely different eras?
It sounds hyperbolic until you look at the specific legal mechanism he is comparing, which is the admission of spectral evidence.
Spectral evidence.
In Salem, the courts allowed accusers, usually young girls, to claim they saw a ghost or a specter of the accused person tormenting them. This is an invisible threat that only the accuser could perceive.
If you were the accused, you couldn't prove your specter wasn't biting them because no one else could see it.
It bypassed the need for physical evidence. The modern equivalent of spectral evidence, Riker posits, is the invisible specter of trauma, or emotional vibes, or feeling unsafe.
Ah, I see. He's saying trauma has become the new ghost.
Exactly. He specifically critiques how trauma theory has been weaponized by feminist academia and imported wholesale into the legal system. In this modern framework, if an accuser remembers an event vividly and with high emotion, that is submitted as proof of trauma.
However, if they completely forget the event, or their story changes constantly, or their timeline is fragmented, trauma experts will testify that memory loss and fragmentation are also textbook proofs of trauma.
Riker points out that this creates a closed loop of circular reasoning. It is entirely unfalsifiable. Whether you remember it perfectly or can't remember it at all, it proves the man is guilty.
Riker argues this makes it anti-scientific, completely devoid of logos, and therefore it should be fundamentally inadmissible in any rational, constitutional, legal proceeding.
So, what does this all mean? If we accept Riker's premise here, that objective facts have been replaced by the spectral evidence of female feelings. What does this all mean when we look at the broader economic landscape? If feelings dictate the law, how does this affect the foundational agreements of society, specifically the contract of marriage?
Riker argues it doesn't just affect them, it destroys them entirely. This is where he delves into his chapter on the demise of contract law. According to the text, pre-1969 marriage was rooted in actual enforceable contract law.
A contract, by definition, requires consideration, mutual obligation, and penalties for breach.
If you wanted to dissolve a marriage prior to 1969, you couldn't just say, "I'm not happy." You had to prove to a court that your partner had committed a breach of that contract, things like adultery, physical abandonment, or severe cruelty.
Because of this, the party who adhered to the terms of the vow was legally protected, and the party who violated the vows faced the financial and social consequences of the dissolution.
But then came the introduction of no-fault divorce, starting in California under Ronald Reagan, ironically enough.
Yes. And Riker contends that no-fault divorce completely annihilated the concept of marriage as a contract. He argues that no-fault transformed marriage into a legal trap designed exclusively for men.
It is now the only contract in Western law that one party can unilaterally void at any time for any reason or no reason at all, based purely on temporary emotional dissatisfaction, while still legally demanding and keeping all the financial benefits and the children produced by the contract.
Let me make sure I'm fully grasping the gravity of what he's saying. He's arguing that because of no-fault divorce, the state actually becomes a financial beneficiary of a broken home.
That is precisely his argument. In this dynamic, the state steps in as what he calls the new patriarch. The state uses the threat of police force to extract resources from the biological father, effectively making the state the ultimate cuckold.
The ultimate cuckold. A bureaucratic entity that facilitates, enforces, and profits from the exploitation of its own male citizens to subsidize female independence.
And the author frames this within a much broader, highly controversial macroeconomic concept he calls economic parasitism. Riker points to demographic data, tax receipts, and voting patterns to make a really provocative claim.
He cites economic studies claiming that women, as a collective demographic cohort, are actually a lifetime net negative tax contribution to the state.
Yes, he relies on data sets from places like New Zealand and the UK, which have studied lifetime tax contributions versus state consumption.
Riker argues that because women generally earn less over a lifetime, live longer, utilize the medical system more, and consume the vast majority of welfare and single mother subsidies, they consume far more in government services than they will ever contribute in income tax revenue.
Conversely, men, specifically middle to upper class working men, are the only demographic that is a net positive tax contributor.
Therefore, Riker argues, women consistently use their majority voting power to expand the welfare state. They vote with politicians who will aggressively tax male earners to redistribute those resources to female dependents.
He also tackles the famous wage gap narrative in this section, calling it an absolute myth that dissolves the second it faces empirical scrutiny. He notes that when you control for actual choices, hours worked, continuous time in the labor force, danger, the gap vanishes.
He cites data showing that men work 57% more hours annually than women.
Furthermore, men completely dominate the most dangerous, back-breaking professions: logging, roofing, deep-sea fishing, oil rigging, accounting for 92% of all workplace fatalities.
So when activists demand equity, where women are paid the exact same across the board regardless of hours worked, sacrifices made, or physical risk assumed, Riker views this as a grotesque inversion of fairness.
It is a system designed to penalize male competence and sacrifice.
To ground this macroeconomic theory in the brutal reality of the family court, Riker provides another case study. This is the tragic story of a man he calls Thomas.
Thomas was a dedicated physician who worked 80-hour weeks for over a decade to build a highly successful medical practice. Over 15 years of grueling shifts, he built a family net worth of about $3 million.
One day, he discovered that his wife, who had not worked outside the home in a decade, had been carrying on an affair with her tennis instructor for 3 years.
Now, under the old logo structure, the pre-1969 rules of contract law, her adultery would be a clear, undeniable breach of contract right. She broke the vow, she would face the penalty.
Exactly. But under the modern rules of no-fault divorce, when Thomas went to court, the judge explicitly informed him that her infidelity was legally irrelevant. It could not even be factored into the division of assets.
So what happened?
His wife, who broke the contract, retained primary custody of their 2 children. She was awarded the marital house, and Thomas was ordered to pay her $12,000 a month in alimony and child support.
And the final twist of the knife, she legally moved her boyfriend, the tennis instructor, into the house that Thomas paid for, while Thomas had to rent a small apartment and continue working 80 hours a week just to fund their lifestyle.
Riker uses Thomas to demonstrate what he means by a resource extraction node. Thomas wasn't treated as a human being, a father, or a victim of betrayal. He was treated merely as a wallet with legs.
This, Riker argues, is the ultimate logical endpoint of what he calls the equity scam. He defines modern equity as a totalitarian mandate that must inherently extract from the productive class to subsidize the unproductive. It demands equality of outcome, which requires punishing the competent.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really begs a massive sociological question. How did society come to accept this? How does a culture justify treating its builders and protectors this way, morally and culturally?
Riker answers this by examining how history itself is being fundamentally rewritten to justify the extraction. And this brings us to his most controversial framework, Mein Kampf.
Yes, Mein Kampf is Riker's highly provocative, intentionally incendiary title for the overarching feminist narrative. The title obviously evokes historical propaganda. He asserts that modern feminism is not a civil rights movement. He claims it is structurally indistinguishable from a grand conspiracy theory.
He defines a conspiracy theory very clearly here. He says a conspiracy theory is a paranoid worldview that attributes all complex societal ills, natural inequalities, and personal failures to the hidden, malevolent coordination of a specific demographic group.
Feminism, he argues, blames a shadowy, omnipotent patriarchy for literally everything from the statistical wage gap to the horrors of war, down to the temperature of office air conditioning being set to male metabolic rates.
He points out a glaring logical trap that feminists fall into. They often claim in academic circles that patriarchy is just a neutral, descriptive sociological term for men holding the majority of positions of power.
But then in practice and rhetoric, they use it to describe a deliberate, malicious, coordinated cabal specifically designed to oppress, subjugate, and extract labor from women.
Riker contrasts what he calls actual objective history with feminist herstory. The academic revisionism of herstory, he argues, operates on a very simple algorithm. It frames every single male achievement or invention throughout time as a theft from suppressed female genius.
Conversely, it frames every historical constraint placed on women as deliberate, hateful, patriarchal oppression.
But Riker argues the exact opposite. If you look at history through the lens of logos, men didn't oppress women. They protected them. They shielded them from a brutal, indifferent, unforgiving nature.
He uses the sinking of the Titanic in 1912 as his prime historical example of this dynamic. On the Titanic, a luxury liner representing the height of patriarchal Edwardian society, 74% of the female passengers survived.
Only 20% of the men survived. Why? Because the men, adhering to the strict patriarchal code of women and children first, actively and consciously stepped aside.
The wealthiest, most powerful men in the world chose to stand on a sinking deck in the freezing dark and drown, specifically so that lower-class women could take the lifeboats and live.
Riker argues this empirical event proves a deep historical legacy of inherent male sacrifice, physical provision, and profound protective duty, not systemic oppression. If the patriarchy was truly a conspiracy to oppress women, the men would have thrown the women overboard to save themselves.
That is a very difficult statistical reality for the herstory narrative to digest. But Riker argues that when empirical evidence contradicts the feminist narrative, the modern institutions don't change their theories. They simply suppress or memory hole the evidence.
He points to a psychological concept called gamma bias. I really want to unpack this because once you understand gamma bias, you start seeing it everywhere in media and law.
Gamma bias is a crucial psychological framework for the listener to grasp. In sociological research, gamma bias occurs when institutions celebrate gender differences that favor women, while ignoring or suppressing differences that favor men.
More specifically regarding behavior, it means that male agency is viewed as absolute. If a man does something wrong, it is entirely his fault, a product of his toxic masculinity.
But female agency is erased. If a woman does something wrong, she is never the villain. She is viewed as a victim of her circumstances, a victim of trauma, or ultimately a victim of a man who drove her to it.
Riker uses the famous Duluth model of domestic violence as the ultimate institutionalized example of gamma bias. Explain how the Duluth model actually works if, say, police are called to a domestic dispute.
The Duluth model was created in the 1980s by feminist activists in Duluth, Minnesota, and it absolutely pervades American law enforcement training today. It posits a rigid theological premise that all domestic violence is inherently rooted in patriarchal control, and therefore men are virtually always the primary aggressors.
If police arrive at a home where a woman has attacked a man, the Duluth model trains officers to look for ways the man might have exercised coercive control that forced the woman to defend herself.
It assumes the man's guilt by default, based on his gender, completely erasing the woman's agency and capability for initiating violence.
The book mentions a woman named Erin Peetsy to highlight just how aggressively and sometimes violently this dogma is protected. If you don't know who Erin Peetsy is, her story is wild. She literally founded the very first modern domestic violence shelter in the world over in the UK. She was a pioneer, but what happened to her?
Erin Peetsy opened her shelter and started taking in battered women. But being an honest observer, she started keeping data. She eventually reported a deeply inconvenient empirical truth. Out of her first 100 female clients who had fled domestic violence, 62 of them were as violent or more violent than the men they were fleeing.
She recognized that domestic violence was often reciprocal and generational, not a one-way street of patriarchal oppression.
For stating this empirical observation, Peetsy was branded a traitor. She was driven into exile by feminist extremists. They bombarded her with bomb threats, boycotted her speeches, and in a truly horrific act of intimidation, they even killed her family dog.
Riker uses Peetsy's story to show that the institutional system we have today is not actually designed to seek truth or prevent violence. It functions as a theological system designed to subjugate men by violently maintaining the dogma that women are eternal, blameless victims.
Riker provides another fascinating example of suppressed historical evidence, this time regarding male psychology and trauma. Going back to World War I found this incredibly relevant to the modern conversation about male mental health.
Yes, the World War I shell shock data. During the horrific trench warfare of World War I, soldiers suffered from what we now call PTSD, then known as shell shock.
Austrian army psychologists began studying the best ways to treat these shattered men. They discovered something counterintuitive to modern therapy. The shell-shocked men healed at dramatically higher rates when they were kept relatively near the front lines, given a structured purpose, and allowed to process the chaos while remaining active in a brotherhood of other men.
Conversely, the men who were passively removed from the war zone, sent back to quiet, comfortable psychiatric hospitals far from the fighting, fared much worse. They deteriorated, dwelling on their trauma.
And Riker argues this vital, life-saving knowledge about how male psychology actually processes trauma was intentionally memory-holed.
Why? Because it completely contradicts the modern, feminized, therapeutic approach to trauma, which insists on passivity, endless verbal and emotional processing, and treating masculinity itself as the disease.
The modern system views male stoicism, courage, and action-oriented risk-taking as a toxic pathology that needs to be medicated out of boys. Riker claims these institutions actively want to redefine healthy masculinity as a mental illness in order to create passive, easily managed, compliant subjects.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Riker caps off this historical section by pointing out what he considers the ultimate hypocrisy in this entire power dynamic, the conscription blind spot.
The conscription blind spot.
He notes that in the modern West, women make up the absolute voting majority. They possess the political power to vote for politicians who can and do declare wars and send men to die in foreign mud.
Yet women are strictly exempt from being drafted into the military themselves.
They enjoy 100% of the rights and privileges of full citizenship, including the power to dictate foreign policy at the ballot box without bearing the ultimate blood-price responsibility of risking their lives for the state.
Meanwhile, men bear the ultimate responsibility of the draft. But, as Riker has exhaustively argued regarding the family courts, they are denied equal protection under the law in their own homes.
It is, as he calls it, a profound systemic asymmetry of justice.
So after laying out this exhaustive systemic critique spanning from the philosophical fall of the logos structure down to the granular crushing mechanics of the family court hydra, and zooming out to the historical revisionism of feminism, Riker transitions the book from a diagnosis of the disease to a prescription for the cure.
He doesn't just leave the reader drowning in black pill despair. He offers a detailed, actionable, tactical manual for you, the listener. He calls this the counteroffensive, a blueprint for judicial warfare.
Exactly. Riker urges men to armor their minds, and the primary weapon he advocates is the Trivium.
Now, if you are listening to this, the Trivium is the ancient classical education model consisting of 3 stages: grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Riker insists these are the essential lost tools needed to dismantle feminist arguments and survive the modern ideological landscape. He says you must first use grammar to define your terms precisely and refuse to play postmodern word games.
You then use logic to identify fallacies, connect premises, and refuse invalid inferences.
And finally, you use rhetoric to persuade and articulate objective truth without relying on emotional manipulation. He spends a lot of time training his readers to identify and defeat specific logical fallacies. The primary fallacy he highlights is the Motte-and-Bailey.
This is such a crucial concept for arguing in the modern world. Can you role play or walk us through exactly how a Motte-and-Bailey fallacy works in real time?
Gladly. The Motte-and-Bailey is a deeply deceptive rhetorical device. It gets its name from medieval castles, which had a highly defensible walled tower, the motte, and a larger, more vulnerable, but highly desirable courtyard below the bailey.
In an argument, a person will make a highly controversial radical claim they are standing in the bailey. When you challenge them on that radical claim and start winning the argument, they instantly retreat to a highly defensible common sense claim. They retreat to the motte.
And from the motte, they accuse you of attacking common sense.
So how does that look in a feminist argument?
A prime example.
Yeah.
The feminist makes the radical Bailey claim. All men are inherently toxic and are part of a patriarchal conspiracy to oppress women, so we need to dismantle capitalism.
When you challenge that with data and say, wait, that's absurd, look at workplace fatalities and male suicide rates, they instantly retreat to the motte.
They say, wow, why are you so angry? Feminism just means we want equal pay and basic dialogue about women's issues. Are you against equality?
They swapped the radical claim for a benign one to make you look like a misogynist for arguing.
Riker instructs men to understand this tactic, refuse to let them retreat, strictly define the terms using grammar, and force the opposition to stand in the bailey and defend their most extreme claims until the logic collapses.
The book provides a brilliant, tangible example of how language is manipulated through grammar, the modern usage of the word gaslighting. We hear this word every single day now.
But Riker notes its actual origin. It comes from the 1944 psychological thriller film Gaslight.
In that movie, a malicious husband utilizes calculated, deliberate psychological torture. He literally dims the gas lamps in the house and hides objects, and when his wife notices, he tells her she is hallucinating, specifically to induce literal psychosis so he can steal her inheritance. It is a highly specific criminal form of abuse.
But Riker argues that modern ideologues and pop psychology TikToks have entirely hollowed the word out. They stripped its meaning. Today, gaslighting has been redefined to simply mean a man disagreeing with a woman's subjective interpretation of events.
If a woman claims a man was aggressively glaring at her, and the man says, "No, I wasn't, I was just looking at the clock behind you," his factual denial of her emotional narrative is instantly branded as gaslighting.
This turns his literal innocence and defense into further evidence of his abuse. It is a brilliant, evil linguistic trap. Riker tells his readers to use the Trivium to reject these redefined terms entirely. Do not adopt their language. Beyond these vital rhetorical tactics, Riker ends the book with a sweeping, radical, strategic solution for the individual man. He calls it the institutional exit.
Because Riker believes the state apparatus, particularly the family court hydra, is entirely irrevocably captured by this gynocentric pathology. He insists that the state simply cannot be reformed from within. You cannot vote your way out of a demographic collapse. You cannot petition the Star Chamber for mercy. Therefore, his central, most controversial directive to his readers is this: a man must absolutely never, under any circumstances, marry or cohabitate under current state law.
Yes. He views signing a state-sanctioned marriage license as the equivalent of volunteering for chains. Why? Because as we discussed with no-fault divorce, you are voluntarily signing a contract that the other party can unilaterally void at any time while the state extracts your resources to reward them for the breach.
In Riker's logo structure, engaging with a rigged game is not noble. It is irrational.
So if a man can't use the state to form a family, what is he supposed to do? Go live in a cabin in the woods alone?
Riker says no. You build parallel structures outside the jurisdictional reach of the Hydra. He calls this concept the Manosphere Jerusalem. It's not a physical plot of land in the Middle East. It is a decentralized digital and cultural network of parallel practices. How does this actually work practically for a guy listening right now?
It requires a complete restructuring of how a man interacts with society. Economically, Riker advocates for holding wealth in unseizable, decentralized assets like Bitcoin or physical precious metals.
He suggests men pivot away from W-2 corporate jobs where their wages can be easily tracked and garnished by state bureaucracies. Instead, he advocates for engaging in gig work, private contracting, or gray market parallel economies where value is exchanged directly between men without the state taking its cut to fund the system.
For legal disputes, he points toward binding private arbitration, completely bypassing the civil court system.
And regarding the most important part, family formation, he doesn't say don't have families. He says don't use the state to have families.
Exactly. He points to certain high-cohesion religious communities as the model. He looks at traditional Latin Mass Catholic societies or strictly Orthodox Jewish sects.
These communities conduct marriages entirely within religious law, and they actively refuse to seek state recognition or state marriage licenses.
Riker notes these specific communities have incredibly high stability rates and virtually non-existent divorce rates compared to the secular mainstream.
And he argues this isn't necessarily because the women in those communities are biologically different.
Right. It's because the structure is different. Dissolution of a marriage in those parallel structures requires actual proven cause. It requires facing a tribunal of religious elders like a Beth Din in Judaism, and it involves intense community accountability and social shaming for breaking a vow.
He argues this returns marriage to the concept of a strictly enforceable contract built on logos, rather than a temporary arrangement based on momentary emotional dissatisfaction.
Ultimately, Riker is calling for a logocentric restoration. He is telling men to quietly rebuild the structures of reason, duty, honor, and objective truth in the hidden, decentralized interstices of a decaying system. You build the lifeboats while waiting for the current bureaucratic behemoth to inevitably collapse under the weight of its own economic parasitism.
To synthesize this absolutely incredible, exhaustive deep dive, Conrad Riker's The Female Question is a sweeping, entirely unapologetic indictment of a system he views as fundamentally mathematically rigged against men.
It is a harsh clarion call for men to wake up from their cultural slumber, to reject the solipsistic standard that elevates fleeting feelings over hard facts, and to actively, intentionally rebuild the logo structure completely outside the jurisdictional reach of the state. It is dense, it is highly controversial, and it pulls absolutely no punches.
It truly is a monumental piece of cultural critique.
And studying Riker's framework raises an incredibly important, profound question for you, the listener, to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
If the traditional state-sanctioned contract of marriage is mathematically broken for men, as Riker meticulously argues, and we begin to see a massive, widespread movement of high-earning men toward purely private, decentralized pair bonding and parallel economies, how will society fundamentally reorganize the concept of family over the next century?
Furthermore, and perhaps more ominously, if men actually succeed in defunding the family court system by starving it of federal matching funds through their refusal to participate in state marriage, will the state quietly accept this?
Or will the state eventually attempt to use police power to outlaw parallel private marriages entirely, just to maintain its extraction mechanisms and keep the Hydra fed?
It is a profound geopolitical, sociological, and ultimately existential question for the future of the West.
It is a terrifying and necessary question to consider. Look, if you want to dive into the heavy artillery of these arguments yourself, if you want to see the specific syllogisms, the historical footnotes, and the raw economic data Riker uses to build this massive framework, you absolutely must buy this book. Do not just take our word for it. Check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to get your copy of The Female Question.
Dig into the sources, and be sure to follow the author's ongoing philosophical warfare at Conrad Riker, at Substack, Twitter, and YouTube.
Finally, if this deep dive brought you value, if it helped you understand the historical and legal roots of these institutional shifts, don't forget to like and subscribe to our show so we can keep bringing you these ultra-long, unflinching, incisive breakdowns. Stay sharp, trust the logos, and thank you for joining us.